Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Daniel Ellsberg, an activist and strategic analyst. He was a key figure in the anti-war movement which helped turn the populace against the Vietnam War. His leaking of the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times set in motion a series of events, including illegal actions by the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, that led to his resignation. Dan, welcome to Berkeley.
Glad to be here.
When did you first become involved with Vietnam?
I really never discussed this before in public, but the fact is I was there in 1961 in connection with a task force or a study group for the Kennedy Defense Department on limited war research and development. And our group, which included, I think, a Berkeley physicist, was Alvarez.
Yes, that's
yeah. Was not a Berkeley physicist who had been involved in the Manhattan Project, and Shockley, of the inventor of the transistor, and a number of others, technical people on the whole, except for me, who was representing the social science, went really to a number of bases around the world, talking to people about what their requirements might be for spending research and development money, budget money, on things for limited war, for conventional war, since most money had gone for nuclear war research up till that point. And Kennedy was prepared to spend money on conventional war, both in Europe and elsewhere. We went to Vietnam in that connection, and I spent just a week there. But I spent that week very actively reading, night and day, really, many hours of reading reports there and talking to the advisory group there. And of course, at that time, which was about August of 1961, there was still only the small number of advisors that were permitted under the Geneva Accords of 1954. I think on the order of 60 or so, a very, very small number, or hundreds at the most. And I got a picture of Vietnam at that point that led me to decide to stay away from that problem bureaucratically for the rest of my career if I could. I came back and helped write a report for RAND, which incorporated what I learned in that study group. And the advice was basically, don't ask for research money for this. Don't get involved. Stay away from it. This is a total loser, essentially. Because it was already apparent in 61, or earlier for that matter, that there was really no promise of Western efforts to subdue the movement for national independence and sovereignty in Vietnam, which was led by communists. But communists who had beaten the French, who had very strong American financial support, material, so forth. We were facing essentially the same people there, and the likelihood that we would do better than the French had done seemed very small. And I actually acted on that to the extent that when I was doing a lot of consulting in the Pentagon, largely on nuclear matters, but I kibitzed on other things.
This would be during the Kennedy administration.
During the Kennedy administration in 61 and 62, 63. I really avoided knowing anything about Vietnam, getting into discussions of Vietnam. I didn't want to be drawn into it. I thought anyone tarred with that essentially would be like being associated with the Bay of Pigs, that perfect failure which had ruined the careers of nearly anybody who had touched it.
But then later, a few years later, you actually went back to Vietnam?
No, I was assigned, actually after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I participated.
It would have been November 60, October 62.
The next year, the fall of 62. I became very concerned about the possibility of nuclear war arising out of a crisis, and about the problematic aspects of decision-making in crises, of understanding what was going on, deciding what was to do. And I could see how a war could have come inadvertently, or without either side really desiring it, out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I wanted to learn more about governmental crisis decision-making. And I got a study sponsored under Walt Rostow in the State Department Policy Planning Group Council, as an interagency study to look at crisis decision-making. And I actually had people helping me, thanks to Walt Rostow, in every department connected with these matters. At the deputy secretary level, or the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the deputy director of intelligence in CIA, the deputy secretary of state, and in defense. and looking at records, very secret records with high clearances, beyond top secret actually, of decision-making in things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Suez Crisis of '56, at which time I'd been a Marine actually in Alexandria Harbor and had watched British and French bombing during that crisis, so I was particularly interested in that one. The U-2 crisis, a number of others, especially, however, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the course of doing that study in '64, I was invited by the assistant